I could, as many do, start this talk with that statistic. But there's this saying that says statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. And I really, really believe that. So I'm going to tell you the story of Doa. You know, every day in my job, I listen to harrowing stories of people crossing dangerous borders and dangerous seas. But when I heard Doa's story, this story really kept me awake at night. And I decided that I needed to share it with the world. Doa comes from the place in Syria called Dara, where the uprising began. She was 16 years old, one of the peaceful protesters who went out onto the street demanding, like many countries in the Arab world, democratic reforms, freedom of speech, and change. But she was also witness to the day when her government turned on the peaceful protesters and shot them, when tanks started rolling into her town. And soon, her beloved home city, her neighborhoods, looked like this. One day, her dad came home wheeling his bicycle, his head down, a small tear in his eyes. And he told his family that his shop, his barber shop in the center of the city that he had built with his own hands and which was sustaining the whole family, had been hit by a rocket and destroyed. And he and his wife spoke that evening after the girls had gone to bed and talked about the rumors of girls being abducted and taken to be raped and never seen again. And they made that fateful decision that so many refugees make to leave their community behind, their home behind, everything that they loved, and to become refugees. They were one of the first wave of refugees leaving Syria, and when they left in 2012, that was just the beginning. Now we have over 5.5 million Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries, and half the population uprooted if you include those who've been internally displaced. They ended up, like many refugees, many end up in camps in the desert, others end up in very modest apartments. UNHCR tries to help them with some funding. That's her dad. That was where they lived in Egypt, and struggling. He managed to find a job. Doa also was working in a factory, but Doa wanted to study. She didn't want to get married. Her dream was to move on, but she was sitting day after day longing for her home country, wanting to take part in the war, watching the news of the bombs, the destruction, and hearing terrible stories. She was in despair until one day there was a little bit of a shift. A young man, also Syrian refugee, spotted her in a staircase, and he fell instantly in love. Now, she had no interest in young men and would have no part of his overtures, but he wouldn't give up. And after all kinds of things, threatening to go back and become a martyr, threatening to take rat poisoning, buying gifts for her sisters, who then tried to convince her what a wonderful man he was. Finally, she gave in, went out on a date, one thing led to another, and they fell in love. And he asked her father for Doa's hand in marriage, and the father said yes, but soon he was struggling too, as so many refugees do in neighboring countries who are overwhelmed with such numbers of their own. So he said to Doa, let's go to Europe. Let's get married there. You can study, I will find work. We will have a future. And he showed her pictures of his friends, some of whom had taken the boats and made it and were in Amsterdam under a bridge studying in a university. Another, a photo of his friend in Munich who had a decent job and was sending money home to his parents. But Doa was terrified of the water. She never learned to swim. In fact, she had a near drowning experience when she was a little girl. And she refused over and over again. And every night when he would come home from the coal factory where he had to work, and she and he would drink tea on the terrace, he tried to convince her again and say, Doa, this is no life. And finally she gave in. And a long story short, he paid smugglers their life savings. She sold her jewelry, her computer, all of their savings, $2,500 each. And 2 arrests later, this is Bassem, by the way, and this is Doa and Bassem in there, eating their favorite food, which was chips. And they ended up being taken to this beach. Now, this is a photograph of the beach during the day. When they arrived with about 200 fellow refugees trying to take the same journey, it was night. The smugglers were cruel. They were shouting at them. They heard shots in the air as they ran into the water to get on it to a dinghy and then be taken out to a boat that looked like this, not resembling the beautiful cruise ship that the smugglers, of course, had promised, but a dilapidated, rusty, run-down fisher boat. And when they were taken out to the boat from the dinghy and pulled up on top, they noticed that there were hundreds of other refugees on the boat. In total, there were 500 Syrians, Palestinians, Egyptians, Christians, Muslims, and 100 children, including Sandra, who was 6 years old, and Masa, who was 18 months old. Doa and Bassem found a place on the top deck. Doa had her feet crunched up. They were so crowded. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, feet to feet. It stank. All they were given was stale bread. And on day 2 in the water, they started to get to know the other passengers and started to worry. And day 3 in the water, Doa said to Bassem, Bassem, I have a premonition. We're not going to make it to the shores of Italy, to the shores of Europe. And he said, yes, we will, Doa. We're almost there. We're going to have the best wedding imaginable. On day 4 in the water, the sun started to rise. And the passengers collectively asked the captain, how much more time until we reach the shores of Italy? And the captain said, 17 more hours, just be patient. And the passengers collectively broke out in song. It was at that point, though, too, that Doa looked over her shoulder, and she saw a boat speeding towards them. And as the boat came closer, she saw that there were 10 menacing-looking men on the boat, waving sticks, hurling the sticks at them, and demanding that they disembark. Well, the parents were terrified. The boat looked even less seaworthy. It was smaller. They didn't understand. And they collectively decided to refuse, and the boat turned around and left in anger. But soon later, Doa saw it coming back. And when it came back, it was speeding at them. And in shock, she realized when she heard this bang that they were ramming a hole in the side of Doa and Bassem's boat, just under where they were on the top deck. And it began to sink so fast that Doa could hardly keep grip of Bassem, who then slipped from her arms, and she held onto the railing. And as the boat was sinking down, she watched as a child was taken by the propeller and cut up and lost their life. And Bassem started yelling at her, Doa, release your hold, because you can get caught up in the propeller too. And remember, Doa was terrified of the water, didn't know how to swim, but she took all of her courage and released her hands, fell into the water, came under this plastic sheeting that had been used to shield the passengers from the beating sun, and felt as an arm was pulling her down by her hair as somebody drowning. And she was able, though, to hold onto the plastic and to pull herself up and to move her arms and legs around, and just thinking this might be swimming. And miraculously, Bassem came swimming towards her with this child's floating ring that looked like this, you know, the kind that toddlers and babies use in calm waters and swimming pools. But Doa was a very petite young woman, and she was able to get up on that swim ring and dangle her arms and legs over the side, and Bassem was treading water next to her. Initially, there were only 100 survivors. Everyone below deck was doomed. And they all kind of grouped together and prayed for rescue. But when a day went by and no one came, there was so much despair. And Doa and Bassem watched as a man in the distance took off his life jacket and sank into the sea. Others crying in despair at the names of their children, their wives, their husbands, forever lost. Later that day, an old man swam, holding onto a gas canister, swam up to Doa and Bassem, and on his shoulder was perched a little baby girl. Her name was Malik. She was wearing pink pajamas, and she was whimpering. And the grandfather said, "Please take this child. I have just lost 27 members of my family. I came from Gaza. I was seeking safety with all of them. I don't have the courage or the strength to go on. Take her as your own." And they took Malik. Doa put her on her chest and watched as the grandfather swam away. He came to check up a couple of times, but then soon drowned in the sea. And then they were three: Doa, Bassem, and little Malik. And I'm going to take a break in this story, and I'm going to come back and tell you what happens, to ask the question, why do refugees like Doa and Bassem take these kind of risks? We are in a situation, I'm sorry now to move to the statistics, but I captured your imagination, I think. So I do want to put this story in context. 68.5 million people forcibly displaced. No time in recorded history have we had that many people on the run, and this slide puts that into perspective. What are they fleeing? This is a photo I took in Syria. The destruction, the bombs that continue on. Old wars are not dying, and new ones continue to rage, or are starting to rage, and people are forced to flee. This little boy I met in the city of Homs, which was once a UNESCO World Heritage Site, pointed to that missile and said, "This missile killed my father," matter-of-factly. There's a poem by this wonderful Somali poet called Warsam Shire, Home, if you look it up. But this line, I think, is just so important to describe the refugee experience. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And so people continue to flee. And UNHCR, my organization, builds refugee camps for them in the desert, or they live in cities like Doa and Bassem did most in the neighboring countries of Syria. And one thing that's really important to know, we're here in the United States, and I live in Europe. If you were to read the media in these countries, you would think that all of the refugees of the world are coming here. Well, in fact, that is so far from the truth. 85% of the world's refugees are in developing countries, countries neighboring the wars. Very important to notice. But these countries, like where Doa was in Egypt at the time, are left very much unsupported. Too little funding going to them, too little funding coming to UNHCR so that we could help the refugees in their first country of asylum. And this is a photo taken in 2015 where refugees decided they were going to deliver a message to Europe through their presence, through their coming, that it was intolerable. We want to put our children in school. We want to work. We can't just exist. We want to thrive, not just survive. So they came to Europe and found an initial welcoming. This is a picture I took at the Vienna train station. It was a beautiful moment, but it was very short. Scenes of Europe. This is a scene of a family who took in Syrian refugees into their homes. Incredible compassion that's still there. However, the political landscape has turned very ugly. This is a photo from the Hungarian border with Serbia. Fences started to go up in Europe. Ugly narratives equating refugees, people fleeing war and persecution with terrorism. People fearing, of course, changes in their culture, calling them migrants instead of refugees who were going to come and take jobs, etc. And then this crossed the border to here. The same narrative that we were hearing from Hungary, that we heard actually in the precursor to Brexit, that it was the refugees coming that were the real threat to our societies. So we're in a situation where the language of politics has turned ugly at a time when what we need most is compassion. And I'm hoping on this stage I want to go back to Doa's and Bassam's story. Now, actually, can we go back one slide, just to the blank slide? This is day 2 in the water. And Bassam, it's in the afternoon, and he's starting to get weak. And he says to Doa, Doa, I have never loved anyone so much in my life as I love you. I am so sorry I put you in this situation, but I can't go on. And as much as she pled with him, promised him, coached him, she had to watch as the love of her life slipped into the sea before her eyes and drowned. And here she was with this little baby Malek. She would have gone with him. She didn't see much purpose to live, except this small baby was on her chest, and she knew she needed to do everything possible to try to save her. And on the following day, and the numbers of people who were still alive at that point was very, very small. A couple of dozen. A mother came up to Doa with a little baby on her shoulder. And it was Masa. Remember that photo I showed you at the beginning of little Masa with her sister Sandra? She said that Sandra has just drowned, and my husband and I can't go on either. Doa, please take this child. And then she was 3. This is an illustration that somebody just sent to me, and when they imagined what she must have looked like in the sea. It was freezing cold at night under a cold moon, and she did everything that she could to kind of warm their veins, and she sang verses to them from the Quran. There was nothing to eat, nothing to drink. During the day, it was scorching hot. She couldn't imagine how she was going to carry on. Others around her were becoming hallucinogenic, and she was beginning to lose hope when on day 4 in the morning, she saw an airplane overhead, and she started waving her arms, and the other survivors were waving empty bottles, but the plane soon passed, and the day went on, and she was going in and out of strength. When, in the distance, she saw this ship, and it's a merchant vessel. It was on its way to Gibraltar, carrying chemicals. And that ship captain, whom I spoke to afterwards, had received a radio call from Malta. Please go to these coordinates. There's been a refugee shipwreck. And when he arrived there, there was another merchant ship already there who wired to him and said, you don't need to bother. We've picked up the survivors. All you're going to find are corpses. But this captain said, I want to see for myself. I'm not going to give up. And so he ordered all the lights to go on. It was dusk. It was getting windy. And his men to go down in a lifeboat. And true, all they were seeing were corpses. But soon, they heard in the distance a voice calling, Arab, Arab, oh God, oh God. And the wind was blowing the voice away, and so they were having a really hard time finding Doa. And Doa was hearing their voice and was trying to yell louder and trying to paddle with one arm to reach them. And finally, after 2 hours, they came across Doa, and they were astonished when she lifted her thin black jacket that was over the babies to see that there were two little babies on her chest. And they were taken up into the rescue boat, and this is Masa and Malik recovering on this merchant ship. But of course, they didn't have any doctors, and they were getting doctors' advice from the radio. And a Greek helicopter came and picked them up. But as the stretcher was being pulled up into the helicopter, Doa looked around the helicopter, saw little Masa wrapped in a white blanket, but there was no Malik. And she asked, where is the baby? And they had to tell her that the little Malik drew her last breath on the board of the boat. So meanwhile, little Masa was taken to a pediatric hospital on the island of Crete in Greece. And she was on the edge of death. Her glucose levels were really low. The doctors were worried that she was going to have a brain injury. And meanwhile, all over Greece, the press was writing about this miracle baby who had survived 4 days and 4 nights on the Mediterranean Sea, and all these offers for adoption were coming through. I'm happy to say that thanks to the wonderful health care that was provided to her and all the love, including from my colleagues in Athens, little Masa pulled through. And meanwhile, Doa was recovering in another hospital on another part of the island, and an Egyptian family took her in. And a number was published on Facebook. And messages started coming in from across the Middle East. Doa, do you know what happened to my brother? Do you know what happened to my father, my friend, my cousin? She had to reply, no. But one of those messages came and said, Doa, I think that you saved my niece, little Masa. And attached was this photograph. And this was from her uncle, who just 1 year before had taken the very same journey and had ended up in Sweden. And I'm very happy to say that we were able, UNHCR, through our resettlement program with Sweden, was able to reunite Masa with her uncle, and she's thriving in Sweden. And Doa was recognized too. The prestigious Academy of Athens gave her an award, and she's won a few other subsequent awards since. But can you go back? I'll get to where she is now. But I have to ask, why do refugees like Doa and Bassem and Masa have to go through this? Why isn't more being done to support the neighboring countries of the wars who are hosting so many people? Why isn't there a massive resettlement program for Syrian refugees? The world did this for the Vietnamese. I believe many of them are in your communities here in the 1970s. Instead, we're seeing a cutback in the numbers of people resettled. Why couldn't Doa receive a visa to study somewhere, or Bassem the possibility to work? But I think mostly, and importantly too, is why is not more being done to stop the wars and the persecution that are driving so many people from their homes? One thing is for sure, no refugee would be on those boats if they could thrive and be safe where they are. And no migrant would ever put their lives in the hands of these notorious smugglers if they could feed their children back home. One thing is for sure, no refugee, no migrant, no person deserves to die trying to reach safety. So on behalf of Doa, that's her there, who is now in a nice, peaceful, snowy town in Sweden, and on behalf, there she is studying, learning Swedish. on behalf of Masa, can we imagine a world, taking a lesson from this, in which every life matters? Thank you very much.